Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. My guest today is Alice Valder Curran, a partner at Hogan Lovells. You might recognize Alice's name and her voice. She was on the show back in September, and we talked a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act and sort of predictions about the federal government and national policy. Well, now it's only about 5 or 6 months later, but the federal government and national policy have changed immensely. And the future of the IRA is still, I think, a bit of a question mark in some regards. So I'm very happy to invite Alice back on the show to give her kind of insider Washington perspective on some of these policy questions. So welcome back, Alice.
Thanks, Jonah. Glad to be here.
And just to remind folks, or if they didn't listen to the first episode, maybe if you could quickly sort of talk about your background and what sort of qualifies you to become some of these things.
Sure, Jonah. I've been doing drug pricing related legal work for over 20 years now. And starting in 2022, when the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted, a lot of my time has been focused on IRA implementation. But beyond that, I also spend a lot of time working in the industry on other drug pricing programs that exist, like the 340B drug pricing program, the Medicaid drug rebate program, Medicare ASP price reporting. So that's what I do day in and day out.
Great. So we're going to get to IRA and we're going to get to some other drug pricing questions. But it feels like we should acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is that everything in Washington is pretty insane right now, especially when it comes to any agencies in the executive branch, all of the federal bureaucracy. So, I mean, what's your thought there? What's the caveat we have to put in front of this conversation? And so far, how does it look like those cuts are affecting the organizations that might be responsible for what we're talking about, like CMS and HHS?
I think the caveat we have to put in front of everything is that we are talking about what happened as of today, and there'll probably be some delay between when we record this and when you post it, and it could be very different, or it could just be, I mean, who knows what. So there's just a lot of flux, either because of new executive orders that come out or because of court decisions that enjoin those executive orders that then may be appealed. So the one thing we can count on is change. But in terms of so far what we see or how we see this impacting the pharma industry, I think that anyone in the private sector knows that when you reduce the workforce, service delivery is going to decline. And there's no reason to think that that's going to be any different at any of these key federal agencies that our industry relies upon, NIH, FDA, HHS, or CMS. So then the question is, well, will those service delivery, where will those service delivery impacts be targeted? And it's unclear because it's unclear who's being let go. We're hearing about folks that had a DEI role or folks who are probationary employees, but that probationary period can be quite long, up to 2 years. And so the impact can be really, really broad. I saw an article that talked about at FDA, 10% of the workforce being reduced at DCRH and 150 or people at CEDAR. That's pretty significant. I've also read press reports about a lot of folks at the drug price negotiation program being let go. And that's simply a factor based that these folks who staff those programs tended to come from other positions in CMS. And those positions are relatively new, so they were within that 2-year probationary period. So they were let go, not because they were necessarily targeting that program, but because they had so many probationary employees since it was a new program that was being stood up. Yesterday, we learned that John Coster, who used to lead the Medicaid division of pharmacy and then moved over to the drug price negotiation program, he's retiring at the end of the week. I saw press today saying lawyers supporting the drug price negotiation program have been fired, but then maybe rehired, or some other folks have been rehired, going back to that change theme. But whatever that impact is, as anyone who's been through a RIF or a layoff knows, it impacts morale. And morale takes a hit even when those processes are handled as well as they can be handled. And I think it's fair to say that this process is not in the category of those that have been well handled. And so I just think morale is incredibly low for reasons I think we all can understand. And when morale's low, you're going to see things like lack of responsiveness, because what folks are focused on are they going to have a job? They're not able to focus on service delivery. So we're going to, I think, see lack of responsiveness to stakeholder inquiries, except at the very highest level. We're going to have a huge loss of institutional memory. And we know all of these programs that we all deal with are very, very long, with long legislative history, regulatory history. We know that there are folks at the agency who are the leading expert on some particular arcane rule that we know they are the people we contact with a particular question. There's real risk that we're losing that. I think we're also going to see just process fouls. There are a lot of procedures that are in place around how to do things. And when you don't have the people power to do that, you're going to see that. And I also worry about the need to harmonize some policies that impact a number of different programs, right? So you have to make sure things in FDA work with, or CMS is relying on FDA standards. Are they coordinating? Are Medicaid and Medicare coordinating on programs that cross those functions? And when you lose people, you lose institutional memory, or you generally just have lower capacity, I think we are more likely to see balls dropped in that sort of coordination across programs.
So even before the new administration started, and in fact, right before, on sort of the way out the door, the Biden administration dropped the next list of drugs that were going to be the next list of drugs that are going to be negotiated by Medicare. So I thought we would start there. Was there anything about that list that was surprising or interesting? And does it say anything about kind of how the IRA is going to continue to be implemented?
Really unclear as to how it's going to be implemented under the Trump administration. But in terms of the second round of list of drugs, I think this time around industry got better at predicting what drugs were going to be on the list or not. I think the first time around, the lists were developed without really focusing on some of the arcane issues about how you quantify Medicare spend. Maybe companies or those who were predicting were looking at net spend rather than WAC-based spend. They weren't thinking to aggregate sales across BLAs that share an active ingredient or NDAs that share an active moiety. And that can sort of raise the expenditures applicable to a particular group of drugs. And so I do think there were some misses the first time around. My sense this time around is that everything that was selected was probably in people's top 20, that there were some that moved around within that top 20. So there, it might not have been everyone's exact top 15, but I think the ones that made the list were probably in the top 15 or close to the top 15 when folks were compiling lists going into that publication date. Then in
So nobody
terms of
was caught off guard.
I mean, I don't know if people were caught off guard. I'm not in a position to comment on that. I certainly haven't. I don't know that I've seen trade press around it. You know, it could be that folks who thought they weren't in the top 15 were caught off guard when they ended up being in the top 15, but we haven't seen anything public around that. And I certainly haven't seen press that talked about, wildly some product that folks thought was like at number 50 that was on the top 15. And then in terms of how CMS did it, it's interesting. CMS just issued, I think yesterday or the day before, an infographic on how they did the selection process this time around. And that's interesting because this is sort of the first Trump administration policy pronouncement on how the selection process was done, even though they didn't do the selection, the Biden administration did. And what was interesting about that infographic is that it's clear that they're still aggregating drugs that share active ingredients or active moieties. We saw that with the number one product on the list, the Novo Nordisk trifecta of products that, Ozempic, Rybelsus, and Wegovy, that they're looking across applications if they share an active ingredient or an active moiety. And that's certainly on that infographic. So the Trump administration isn't backing down from that CMS policy from the Biden administration. But something that I did notice in that infographic that was the first time I saw stated in policy was a reference to how CMS is treating products that were originally approved under NDAs and then subsequently deemed to be BLAs, effective March 2020. And it looks like CMS, for those products, they're restarting the clock in 2020. They didn't really say that explicitly, but that was the import of how they described how they are treating those products. And I don't remember seeing anything specific about that in the prior CMS guidance. So that's maybe something new.
Can you spin that out a little more? The acronyms you use, and what are the particular things we're talking about?
So as a reminder, products aren't eligible to be selected for negotiation unless, if it's an NDA product, it's been approved at least 7 years prior. And if it's a BLA product, at least 11 years prior. So that's one piece to remember. The other is that CMS has interpreted the standard to mean that if you have a manufacturer that has an active moiety that's included in a given drug, and that active moiety has distinct NDAs, that CMS is going to treat those distinct NDAs as a single drug for drug selection time clock purposes, and is going to start the 7-year clock from the earliest approved NDA. And so if you have a second NDA that shares an active moiety, and that NDA was only approved 2 years ago, but the first NDA was approved at least 7 years ago, CMS is going to pull both of those into the negotiation process. And the same is true for a BLA that shares an active ingredient, as long as the earliest of those BLAs was approved at least 11 years before the selection date. And what this interesting, curious reference in the infographic is it seems to suggest that for some category of products where they were originally approved under NDAs, before FDA had a biologics pathway, and that once there was a biologics pathway, FDA transitioned those products to BLAs. It may be that CMS is treating those products as having their clock restarted in 2020. I'm
So
hypothesizing
not just a for being BLAs, but possibly like a restarted clock.
Maybe. I'm hypothesizing based on about 10 words in an infographic. I'm just referencing that because your question was, how is this going to roll out? We haven't really seen much from the Trump administration on specifics about how they're going to implement the program, but this was unique that came out. And then you also asked, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, no, that's exactly what I was going to ask about next, but I'll let you say what you were going to say.
So then you had also asked about, insights into the negotiations that happened in the past. And I wanted to comment a little bit on, obviously over the summer, we saw the quote unquote negotiated prices that came out, the significant discounts off of WAC for virtually every drug on that list. I think the lowest discount was maybe around 30%, maybe closer to 40% if memory serves. And virtually every other drug was at 50% or more. So really significant discounts off of WAC. And then CMS also released their putative explanations for how they got to that price. And in general, I think folks found those explanations not particularly informative. The one part of those explanations that I want to flag that I find troubling is CMS's position that they would use a product as a therapeutic alternative for purposes of price comparing and negotiating against the selected drug. So they, are selected drug A, and then when CMS would propose what they think the MFP should be, they would typically tag that or tie that initial proposed MFP to some product that they would deem a therapeutic alternative to the selected drug. And what CMS said in their explanations is, well, just because it's a therapeutic alternative for negotiation purposes doesn't mean it's a therapeutic alternative for formulary or actual use purposes, which to me is a ridiculous statement. How can you use a product as a comparator for value determination on the one hand, while on the other hand, you explicitly say, but you shouldn't be substituting it for treatment? And so to me, that was really concerning that CMS would take that position, or I suppose not even just concerning, but sort of highlights the problematic nature of some of these negotiation processes. So that was one thing from those explanation documents that I found pretty interesting.
Because what that allows them to do is actually essentially negotiate on more drugs than the law says they can, because they lump them together in these groups, right?
That's certainly true with that active moiety or active ingredient standard. Yes, they are selecting not 10 drugs in the first round, but 14 or 15, and not 15 in the second round, but north of 20. And then when they are negotiating those prices, they are using comparators that they are effectively conceding can't be substituted and shouldn't be substituted for the drugs, but they nevertheless want to use it as a comparator for price purposes.
That's really interesting. Let's talk about the Trump administration. I know that, in publicly, he has sort of expressed some support for continuing to the negotiations. Now that he's in, what's the read? I got the sense talking to some folks at JPM that there was some hope that the Trump administration would be willing to negotiate on some of the finer points, the pill penalty, things like that the industry's particularly been concerned about. Obviously, this is all pretty speculative, and I don't think much has been said on the record. But how is everybody thinking about how the new administration is going to administer this, and also whether they'll be willing to sort of make some changes that the industry has been asking for?
It's a great question. A lot of people are really crossing their fingers on that. I'm a skeptic about whether we're really going to see that change. There's certainly nothing that CMS has done today. Who knows what will happen tomorrow? But as of today, that suggests they're doing anything other than full speed ahead on negotiations, including, as I just mentioned, the release of this infographic on how they selected drugs. That's not something you do if you're stepping back from the program. That's something you do if you really want to go all in on the drugs that have been selected and that are subject to the process. What we have heard is statements about being more transparent in the process. I've heard that from a number of quarters, that they want to have more meetings, and we've seen announcements of more meetings with stakeholders, including patients in particular, to get their views. And so I do think that they are seeking feedback on how to improve the process. So who knows what they'll do with that, but they are asking for suggestions on how to improve the process and make it more transparent. And so for all your listeners out there, if you feel strongly about a way that that process should be improved, you should find a way to get that to CMS, because I do think that they want to hear that. Everything I'm hearing is that is a good faith request. They really want to make the process better. And so if you have thoughts about that, you should find a way to get them submitted. But beyond that, it is unclear. I mean, we still have statutory deadlines that have to be satisfied. The agreements have to be signed. The data has to be submitted. That's required by statute. So there's nothing that the Trump administration can walk back from that. So we'll just have to see how the negotiations progress. And remember, those negotiations are highly confidential. CMS's position to date has been it will keep things confidential if the manufacturers do. If manufacturers disclose what's happening in the negotiations so that it becomes public, then CMS will use that as an opening for them to start talking about it as well. But we certainly didn't see any leaks the first time around from manufacturers about how that process was going. I'm not expecting we will this time either. So how the negotiations actually progress, whether it really is different, we might not find out until this time next year.
Interesting. What about the kind of ongoing effects of the IRA? That's really what we were talking about the first time when we chatted in September about, some of these unintended effects, and how the law is impacting pharma's planning and decision making. Any updates around that in the last few months, and maybe anecdotes or what you've heard?
So we've certainly continued to hear from manufacturers themselves about programs that they're delaying or shelving because of the so-called pill penalty in particular, that differential timing for a small molecule to be subject to price controls versus a large molecule. But the most recent study that caught my eye came out in January from an organization called Vital Transformation. It's not yet peer reviewed. They're very clear about that. But what it did was focus on the IRA's impact on early stage venture capital investment. I think their hypothesis was that if you're looking at investments in products that have already in the clinic, those products are hard to pull back because they're already fairly far along in the process. And so pulling back from them is a harder decision. And so they really wanted to focus on earlier stage products that maybe hadn't moved to the clinic yet, to see where the investment trends were and if they could see a difference there. And what they found was that the aggregated total investment in large molecules in 2024 was 10 times larger than that for small molecules, which underwent a 70% decline after passage of the IRA.
Wow.
And they also, exactly, that's a big, big change. And they also looked at, sort of individual investments into small molecules, which declined as exposure to Medicare aged populations increased. So some really interesting findings, again, not peer reviewed. So we'll see what happens through that process, but it was an interesting take to sort of focus on the earlier stage where there's a lot more optionality about where you put your money when the program hasn't progressed into the clinic. So as I said, caught my eye. That's what I have really thought more about in the last couple of months. But I also want to talk about a couple of other ways we're seeing the IRA impact the industry, and with, we're all in this business to get important therapies to patients, and there are a couple of patient access angles I also thought it might be worth talking through. And the first is keeping an eye on formulary placement for the first round of drugs as we head into 2026. So, the products that were selected for negotiation in the first round are all really successful therapies because they have really high revenue, right? So there's a reason they have high revenue. It's because they're on a lot of formularies. They have great patient access. There's a lot of Part D coverage. And that's why they had the level of Medicare expenditures that put them in the top 10. We also know that there's no requirement that Part D plans include selected drugs on their formulary. Now, CMS has said in their guidance that they're basically going to engage in a finger wagging exercise with the Part D plans going into 2026 to say, hey, you better include these products on your formulary because they're really good products, but there's nothing that CMS can do to require that. And so as we head into 2026, it's really going to be interesting to see whether we have lesser patient access to these incredible therapies because of these negotiated prices and because of the PBM business model, where that business model seeks high list prices with big rebates. The maximum fair prices are effectively causing a reduced list price effectively rather than a rebate. That means they're less attractive economically to PBMs and Part D plans. And does that mean that they're just less interested in having them on formulary, such that you see a decline in formulary access for selected drugs going into 2026, as opposed to them holding steady, which would really be a shame. I mean, these products are super successful because they're super effective. We want to make sure that patients have access to them. And it'd be concerning if a pretty huge unintended consequence of the IRA is that patients actually have less access.
I mean, now we're getting very speculative, but if that were to materialize, what, if anything, could the government do to encourage those formularies to continue to include these drugs?
CMS talks a lot about this in their guidance. This was guidance under the Biden administration, where they talk about how CMS has a formulary review process for Part D plans in general. And so the government would have to find a way through that holistic formulary review process to force a very specific formulary placement. It wasn't clear exactly how that would work, but that was, as I said, the finger wagging exercise is my shorthand for that when CMS says that they're going to be looking at the formularies. But I think, there's a real possibility that we're going to actually see less formulary representation in terms of, population. If you look across Medicare lives that have access to products, to these selected drugs at the right tier, that they'll have less access in our 2026, or that's the risk that we really have to watch for.
That's an interesting segue into what I was going to ask about next, which is PBM reform, because it feels like the PBMs have already been in the government's crosshairs to some extent. And, something like this, I don't know, could put it over the top. But anything you're hearing about that? I mean, for me, it seems like it's always just been a lot of talk and nothing particularly substantive.
Well, we came very close to seeing a PBM reform bill at the end of the year, or the end of the legislative session. It sort of got dropped out at the last minute. That is something that we're hearing the Trump administration is in favor of. Secretary Kennedy stated during his confirmation hearing that the administration is committed to PBM reform. He stated that the president is absolutely committed to fixing PBMs. And, we've seen trade press that talks about that as well. Senators Grassley and Cantwell have recently reintroduced two PBM bills aimed at addressing PBM practices and promoting transparency. So, that is something from a policy perspective the new administration seems to support. Whether it gets enacted, and in particular what it means for budget impact. I mean, right now we're in the middle of talking about the budget and the need for huge savings in order to be able to fund the continued tax cuts and other cuts that the administration has as a priority. So if there's a way to structure this in order to help generate savings, that would help it. But surely from a purely policy perspective, this is something that the administration appears to strongly support. It's just a question of whether it will actually get enacted this time.
Yeah. I mean, do we know what the blocker was last year? Because it feels like it's sort of has bipartisan support.
I don't have any insights on the tea leaves there. I don't think it was the only item that got dropped out at the last minute, but it certainly was a pretty significant one that did get dropped.
And then, as long as we're talking other things, and I know you had one more thing you wanted to mention, we can circle back at the end. 340B reform. Any tea leaves there?
There will certainly be some proposed 340B legislation. We saw some last time around. It didn't really go anywhere. Tom Engels, who served as the HRSA administrator in the last 2 years of the first Trump administration, is back in that role. So at least we have an administrator who has familiarity with the program, doesn't have to go up the learning curve. So we could have reform. There's a lot of litigation going on now, both at the federal and state level around 340B reform. There's a lot of state legislative activity on 340B at the moment. So we'll see. One thought I had is in the pursuit of Medicaid savings, which is, again, part of the budget bill that's so important, is they're focusing on finding a significant level of Medicaid savings. I'm increasingly reading news reports and studies that talk about how the 340B program actually costs state Medicaid programs money. And so
I hadn't made that connection, but that's, yeah, if they're serious about looking for fraud, waste, and abuse, what a place to start. Right.
That's certainly one place to look, but it's also just a straight up saver, right? So if the 340B program is actually generating increased costs to the Medicaid program, is some reform there a place to at least get some incremental savings on the Medicaid side, among a host of other things that wouldn't necessarily require cutting benefits or eligibility, or the harder choices that I think people are really concerned about if you're looking for Medicaid savings.
Yeah. I'm skeptical that the math works out, but again, it's a place to start.
I used incremental for a reason. It's never going to close the gap all the way, but none of the changes that folks are going to talk about are going to close the gap on their own. So it's going to be a matter of pulling together a bunch of different slices on that number, and this might be a source of one group of savings.
And then, did you have one more thought about the IRA that you wanted to share that I kind of cut you off?
I had two more. So we talked about patient access. We talked about patient access and the impact of the IRA on patient access when we look at formulary placement in 2026. So just watch that space. The other thing we're looking at in 2026 is the MFP effectuation process. So we now have these MFPs, and the statute requires that the MFP be provided at the point of dispensing to the Medicare patient. And that means that by January 1, we have to have this infrastructure set up so that patients get the benefit of the MFP at the point of dispensing. Pharmacies, which are going to purchase products in the normal course at whatever commercial prices, get rebates in a pretty short timetable to make them whole for the difference between their acquisition cost and the MFP. And that is definitely akin to the metaphor of building the plane while you're flying it, because we are less than a year out from that deadline. That means any pharmacy in any corner of the United States, no matter how remote, has to be able to adjudicate a claim, find a way to submit their claim to get this rebate for a significant price difference, right? We talked earlier about the difference between WAC and these MFPs, and it's pretty significant. And the pharmacies have to float the money in the interim. And so there was some trade press a few months ago that talked about, large chunks of the pharmacies of the United States are not particularly interested in carrying MFP price drugs going forward because they don't want to have to carry that float. And so that means, again, these products that are terrifically effective, that's why they're so successful. That's why they're on the list. Not all of them have generic competition or biosimilar competition yet. So it's not like there's some other product out there that is equivalent that could be dispensed. And will patients not be able to access them because the effectuation process just creates too much of a cash flow concern for them? And CMS, in rolling out their effectuation guidance, said to manufacturers, if pharmacies have significant cash flow concerns, we're going to ask them to identify that. We'd like you to try to find a way to help them. I think the manufacturers, listen, they do what they do because they want to make sure patients have access to their therapies, but the manufacturers need to be able to validate claims are eligible for the MFP before they issue that significant price differential And there's only so fast that can occur. And so I think we also just have to look at what happens to Part D pharmacy networks. Are they going to shrink even further? For the pharmacy networks we do have, are some of those pharmacies just not going to carry MFP drugs because they, even if they're willing to do the cash float, they kind of want to wait for the kinks in this system to be worked out before they sign up for it, because it's going to be complicated. So I want us to keep an eye on that in terms of patient access. And then last but not least, on how the IRA is impacting the industry, I just want to put a placeholder out there for folks to watch this space for the third round of selected drugs. Now, we won't get that for another year or so. What we will see this year is CMS's guidance for that third round. And the reason this third round is different from the first two is the third round will include Part B, as in boy, drugs. So physician administered drugs. Everyone expects Keytruda to be at the top of the list. Merck has come out with in the press recently sort of acknowledging that they expect Keytruda to be on the list. But the way buy and bill drugs get to patients, the economics of that are very different than pharmacies. And so when CMS issues its guidance, we are expecting to see that draft guidance sometime in Q2. It's going to be different because the dynamics are going to be very, very different for Part B drugs than Part D drugs. And that'll just be something to keep an eye on later this year.
We're getting close to where we should probably cut off for time, but I would love for you to kind of talk a little bit more about that difference in dynamics between Part B and Part D. Just a little more color there.
Sure. So, pharmacy drugs, pharmacies are used to having arrangements with plans that focus on which products are going to be covered or not, having set reimbursement rates for plans. With Part B drugs, Part B providers, your doctors, your oncologists, your rheumatologists, they don't work with a, Aetna or Humana or United to figure out what's going to be covered like a pharmacy does. They just bill Medicare. And the economics are such with the buy and bill process that these providers buy these products, they bill them to Medicare, and then they get reimbursed at a reimbursement rate that on average is going to exceed their acquisition cost by 6%. And that 6% delta is really important to the practice economics of those providers. And you have in those providers the entities that are both prescribing the product, so choosing the product to use, as well as buying and dispensing and getting reimbursed for that. And so the practice economics matters to that. And if the MFP is lower and the reimbursement rate is lower, that impacts the practice economics. We have the same problem with floating the price along the way, but it's really putting physicians in particular in the middle of this that's going to be different. I just think it's going to be very different than having pharmacies in the middle of it and just dynamics that we haven't seen before.
Well, this has been really interesting, Alice. All kinds of things you mentioned that I hadn't heard before or hadn't thought about. So I really do appreciate your perspective, and I do like the idea of making this a regular thing. Any other thoughts? Anything we haven't talked about? I mean, there's loads of things, but or maybe just summarizing parting thoughts.
Lots going on in drug pricing. It's not going away anytime soon. It will be really interesting as the Trump administration's views on the IRA become more clear and communicated, because we don't really know exactly what they think they want to do yet. We know that they're committed to the process, but we don't know how it's going to roll out. So watch the space, see what happens. And then also just a couple of other things to keep in mind. We're hearing about these Medicaid cuts, whether they're coming or not. Oh, actually, Jonah, one other thing that just came out today that I wanted to do as a news flash, which is Secretary Kennedy. Maybe for the podcast, we focus on this. Secretary Kennedy issued today a notice about sort of a stepping back from notice and comment rulemaking for processes in HHS. So starting in 1971, I believe, HHS issued a doctrine that basically said, we are going to err on the side of notice and comment rulemaking, even where we don't have to do that as a matter of statutory requirement. And today, Secretary Kennedy issued a policy announcement saying, we are retracting that statement from the early 70s. So 50 years later, HHS is no longer going to err on the side of engaging in notice and comment rulemaking when they don't have to. They're going to they're just going to do it directly and not take on that burden. Now, the Medicare program, by and large, requires by statute notice and comment rulemaking for most important topics, but the Medicaid program doesn't. And so we now may see a lot less notice and comment rulemaking, which is concerning because in general, that process makes the rules better. Hearing from stakeholders, getting that feedback typically makes the end result better. And it could impact a whole host of other programs as well. So there's a lot of change. That's been the theme of our conversation. We have to see how the Trump administration rolls out a number of these existing statutory schemes. But now we also have thrown into the mix the possibility that we're going to see a lot less formal accounting of stakeholder feedback through the notice and comment rulemaking process unless Congress has mandated that the agency do so.
Well, and notice and comment also just made sure that people got a heads up about things, because there had to be enough time. So you can see, possibly just changes dropping much more quickly and unexpectedly.
Indeed. Indeed. And to that point, historically, the agency has been very careful about releasing major rules after markets close, for example, because of the market impact that some decisions can have. And that is made more important if you're going to have pronouncements of policy where there's been no previewing of it through a proposed rule. And instead, if you just have rules getting dropped or policy pronouncements getting dropped without any warning of what might be coming so that the market can socialize to that.
Yeah. One area, and I know this is probably a little out of your scope, where I'm most familiar with notice and comment is the FDA, which I guess would also be covered by this. It's also part of HHS. I know all of their guidance has come out with this comment period. It'll be interesting to see, if there's a change there too.
Yeah, I'm looking up quickly where the language applies, and it has to do with grants, benefits, or contracts. So it's unclear how that might apply in the FDA context, but I think with this pronouncement, I would expect the agency to read that aggressively and take the position that they don't need to engage in rulemaking unless it's very clear that they have to engage in rulemaking, and that's how they will proceed going forward.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. A little breaking news and a little bonus conversation. But great to have you as always, Allison. And that report you mentioned about patient access, the one you said hasn't been peer reviewed yet, but if you're able to send me a link to that so I can share it with the listeners, they can dig in themselves. That'd be great too.
I will happily do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great one.
Thanks, Jonah.
That concludes this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at pharmaphorum. Thanks for listening.